welcome back to Law&Crime Trial Network. I'm Stacey Delikat. Thanks so much for being with us this afternoon. I have an amazing panel with me. It is a ladies' afternoon here in the studio. I have Catherine Smith, trial attorney, and Terry Austin, also a trial attorney, both who will be joining me to break down the trial we are following. So that was a snippet of the prosecutor giving his opening statement in this penalty phase as he once again told jurors about the heinous way, as he said, that Jennifer Fulford was murdered. He said it was atrocious and cruel, reminded the jurors of the duct tape around her mouth, the fact that she was stabbed, and he talks about the fact that this was planned because it began 2 weeks earlier with the purchase of various items at the Walmart. We know those include the zip ties, the duct tape, etc. Really, in a penalty phase, the hardest part is for the defense, right? So let me start with you, Terry, and for the prosecution, I mean, what do they need to make sure to hit on that? They want to, I think, you know, and as we'll revisit some of the testimony from the victim's family members, that's a big part here, remembering the victim, right? What else do they need to sort of nail on the head in the penalty phase?
Well, from the defense standpoint, they need to show that the background of the defendant should lead you towards not convicting him of the death sentence. From the prosecution side of it, they want to show all of the mitigating and aggravating, rather, circumstances. And so they're going to show that it was a heinous crime. They're going to show that the victim suffered during the whole situation. So I think that this crime was heinous, and the jury's going to listen to all of that.
Catherine, what do you think, you know, in addition to sort of hammering home the absolute the absolute cruelness of this killing, what else does the prosecution need to make sure they get to the jury? Is it the premeditation? Is it the planning that this happened, that he went to the Walmart 2 weeks ago to buy the zip ties and the duct tape and whatever else?
I think the premeditation is absolutely critical, but I think really where you're going to tug at the heartstrings of the jury is showing how much pain she suffered and for such a prolonged period of time, and how unnecessary all this was.
And certainly we do hear that from the attorney, and also you hear, you know, what pulls on the heartstrings, right, is hearing from the victim's children, from her family members who are now suffering in her wake, and talk about what an amazing person she was. You know, it's not like their mother died of natural causes. She was the victim of a very, very brutal murder, and we're going to revisit some of that testimony as well. But first, let's listen to how the defense began their case in the penalty phase. So there we hear from the defense attorney some of the points they hope to emphasize during this penalty phase. All of the abuse that Scott Nelson suffered as a child at the hands of his own father. When he was in prison for bank robbery, he suffered physical abuse. She said he was raped by a cellmate. The list goes on. And obviously, this is sort of the meat of their argument, right? Using all of the abuse, all of the terrible things this man experienced in his life to try to paint a picture of why it led him to kill this innocent woman. The question is always, will it be enough? Will it be enough to convince jurors to spare his life? So, Catherine, you know, from that kind of short list she sort of just gave to the jurors about all of the abuse, all of the terrible things he went through, what was your take on it? I mean, were you particularly moved by it?
It's really sad, right? I mean, it's really terrible that he had this upbringing. I mean, it's horrible. No one should be raped in jail. But a lot of these things, such as like arguably the getting into jail and some of the abuse of drugs and alcohol, those are things that he had potentially within his control to manage. And so I think the jurors might look at that with a little bit more skepticism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? He made decisions, he made choices that led him to jail. So it's very unfortunate and very tragic that he experienced all this abuse and violence and sexual violence in jail. But could he have spared himself from jail altogether? I mean, yes, right? Do you agree, Terry?
I agree 100%. I think what the defense is trying to show is the jury should be compassionate here, that the defendant had a very difficult upbringing, that when he did go to jail, he had a difficult time there as well, and that his life should be spared.
Wow, some powerful, very heartbreaking testimony there from Jennifer Fulford's daughter as she talks about calling her mother's voicemail just to hear, "Hi, I can't come to the phone right now." What a wonderful, wonderful person she was. Certainly this does not help Scott Nelson's case, right, Terry?
That's exactly right. This was a very impactful statement. I think that the daughter showed the jury how much her mother's life meant to her, losing a mother is difficult under any circumstances, but here you had a mother who was brutally murdered, and I think that the jury is going to take notice of that.
Catherine, I mean, she also just talks about, she was the only, she unconditional love, such a great person, and we'll hear a little bit more from this from some other family members. But certainly you get the idea this was a wonderful woman who was loved and loved others. I mean, she took care of children, right?
Right, and like why, theoretically it shouldn't matter if someone takes a life if they're a great person or a less great person, but it does really get you in the heart when you hear that this woman was so selfless, giving, she took care of people for a living, and she had such a strong bond with her family. It's just tragic.
And completely innocent. Let's hear from her husband, Robert Fulford, who I understand has actually been in the courtroom for most of this trial, watching as it unfolded, watching as the defendant told his story. Let's hear what he had to say. Tough to watch, more emotional testimony there. Ladies, let me ask you this. When we hear this testimony from the victim's daughter, from her husband, they're obviously so traumatized by this. They're hurting so much. We hear what a great woman she was. And then you juxtapose this. We don't know whether Scott Nelson will testify in this phase, but from what we heard from him in the first part of the trial, which was really no remorse, which was really that he was the victim in all of this. He was victimized by the system, essentially. How does that, play out? Are they weighing that against this? Not necessarily, but certainly from the victim, from the defendant rather, we've heard no remorse so far. Do you agree with that, Catherine?
I do. I think that one of the things that the jury really looks at is someone who's taking accountability for their actions, and sort of flipping that card and playing the victim is just, especially in the face of this just heart-wrenching testimony, is a bad play for the defense. It doesn't work well.
Do you think there's any chance we may hear some kind of apology or remorse this time in the penalty phase? I mean, this is his last chance to save his life. You think we'll hear a bit of a change of tune from him if he decides to testify? What do you think, Terry?
I think he's going to be very similar to what we've seen in the early part of the trial. He is cold, he's callous, he's calculating, and so far he has been very sarcastic, and he's shown no remorse, no contrition, and I think he's not going to be able to change when he testifies, if he testifies in this portion of the trial.
Do you think it would hurt him to testify in this portion of the trial?
I do. I think it would hurt him a lot unless he can show some remorse, but he doesn't seem able to do that.
Do you agree, Catherine?
I agree, but I think there's almost nothing left to lose at this point. That what we have seen of him is so awful that if he's going to make any last-ditch effort, this is the time to do it.
Right. I mean, and it would have to be a real about-face, I think,
right.
From what we heard. And one of my guests last week, said he obviously wants to tell his story. This is all about his opportunity to shine and get his, because remember, he only wanted to tell his account of the versions. When the prosecutor started asking him about the murder, about the details, he was like, oh, I don't want to do this. So it'll certainly be interesting to see what happens this afternoon. We're going to take another quick break. We're going to be back with much more on this trial, plus another controversial story making headlines out of Alabama. Stick around. Be right back.